I'm Edward, and I'm truly delighted you've chosen to spend this quiet evening with me. Before we begin, I'd love to ask you something. Think back to the warmest summer afternoon of your childhood. Perhaps a garden party, a village fair, or a long lazy afternoon with people you loved. Do you carry that memory with you still? Leave your answer in the comments below. I read every single one, and your stories always make this little community of ours feel like home. If you're new here, do subscribe so you never miss a peaceful evening gathering with us. There is something deeply comforting, I find, about the rhythm of an English village summer, the bunting, the teacups, the smell of warm jam and fresh-cut grass. And yet, as Miss Marple has taught us, even the most cheerful afternoon can carry a quiet shadow beneath it, if only you know where to look. Tonight we find ourselves on the village green of St Mary Mead, where the parish picnic is in full swing, and where, before, the day is done. Nothing will ever quite be the same again. Now, settle back, and let's step into tonight's mystery together. Chapter 1. The Green and the Gathering. The morning of the St Mary Mead Parish Picnic had arrived, with the particular smugness of an English summer day that knows precisely how charming it looks. The sky was the colour of a blue wren's egg, unmarked, unbothered, and entirely too pleased with itself. The village green, ordinarily a quiet stretch of grass where old Mr. Finch walked his arthritic spaniel each morning at 7, had been transformed overnight into something approaching splendour. Bunting in cream and cornflower blue stretched between the old elm trees. Trestle tables, borrowed from the church hall and covered in mismatched linen, bent slightly under the weight of Victoria sponges, potted meats, cucumber sandwiches cut into precise triangles, and, at the very centre of Mrs. Clement's table, 6 jars of prize-winning strawberry, preserve, each one sealed with a wax-paper top and a handwritten label in violet ink. It was, by all accounts, a perfect morning. Miss Jane Marple had risen at 6:30, as was her custom, and had spent a productive 40 minutes deadheading her roses before the dew had quite dried from the grass. She was now making her way across the green at a pace her nephew Raymond would have described, not unkindly, as geological. She carried a shallow basket containing a modest contribution of her own, 3 pots of her elderflower cordial, and wore her second-best lavender cardigan, the one with the small pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. She noticed several things before she had reached the first trestle table. She noticed that Colonel Aubrey Hartley Cross, a broad-shouldered man of 67 with the complexion of someone who had spent too many years in a hotter climate and never quite forgiven England for being cooler, was standing with his back to the crowd near the far elm. He was not speaking to anyone. He was watching. She noticed that the vicar's wife, Mrs. Dorothy Clement, was arranging her preserve jars with a precision that had very little to do with aesthetics and rather more to do with nerves. Her hands moved the jars an inch to the left, then back again, then straightened a label that did not need straightening. And she noticed, with the quiet attentiveness of someone who has spent 81 years studying the peculiarities of human behaviour in small communities, that the woman seated alone at the end of the third trestle table, a thin, pale creature of perhaps 50 in a grey cotton dress, was watching Mrs. Clement with an expression that was not admiration and not envy, and not quite anything that had a comfortable name. The woman's name, Miss Marple would later learn, was Miss Edith Plummer. She had come to St Mary Mead 14 months ago as a companion to old Mrs. Hartley Cross, the Colonel's mother, who had since passed away in February. She had remained. Nobody had quite asked her to stay, and nobody had quite asked her to leave, which is a social condition far more precarious than either. Miss Marple set her elderflower cordial on the nearest available surface, accepted a cup of weak tea from young Tommy Biggs, the verger's boy, and settled herself into a folding chair with the contented air of someone who has absolutely no intention of going anywhere. The picnic, as picnics do, began. And somewhere, before the afternoon was out, it would end in a way that no one, except perhaps one quietly watchful old lady in a lavender cardigan, would be entirely prepared for. Chapter 2. The Sugar and the Shadow. The picnic reached its comfortable midday rhythm with the unhurried certainty of a village institution that has been performing itself for so long it scarcely requires human participation any longer. Committees formed and dissolved around the tombola table. The Reverend Gerald Clement moved through the crowd with the practised benevolence of a man who has learned, over 30 years of parish ministry, that the secret to a successful village event is to appear simultaneously available to everyone and committed to no one in particular. He shook hands, admired children he did not recognize, and accepted 2 slices of Battenberg cake from different women without letting either observe the transaction. Miss Marple watched all of this from her folding chair, with the expression her nephew Raymond called her knitting face, pleasantly blank on the surface and underneath, moving at considerable speed. She was, in particular, watching the sugar bowl. It sat at the centre of the main refreshment table, a wide, shallow bowl of white porcelain with a small blue windmill painted on the side, the kind of thing one finds at a church sale, and which achieves a curious immortality by being too ordinary to discard. Beside it, a pair of small silver tongs. Beside those, a card in Mrs. Clement's violet handwriting, "Please help yourself, D.C." It was, to the untrained eye, entirely unremarkable. Miss Marple had not possessed an untrained eye since approximately 1923. What she'd observed, and filed away with the careful precision of a woman who has learned that the most important things are always the ones that happen in the margins, was this. At 11:47, Miss Edith Plummer had approached the refreshment table alone. She had poured herself a cup of tea. She had stood for a moment with her back to the crowd, just a moment, no more than 8 or 10 seconds, before turning back around and carrying her cup to the far end of the table where she sat and drank it without speaking to anyone. It was not the action itself that interested Miss Marple. It was the stillness of it, the particular quality of stillness that belongs to a person who is being very careful not to appear to be doing something, which is an entirely different quality from the stillness of a person who is simply standing still. She'd seen that stillness before, in a woman called Grace Petheridge 30 years ago, who had stood at a sideboard in precisely that manner for almost exactly the same duration of time. The inquest, 3 days later, had recorded a verdict of natural causes. Miss Marple had always considered that particular verdict one of the great impertinences of the St. Mary Mead coroner's office. She said nothing. She picked up her own teacup. She had taken it without sugar, as was her custom, and she continued to watch. Colonel Hartley Cross had, by 12:30, detached himself from the elm tree and was now moving through the gathering with the controlled reluctance of a man discharging a social obligation he had agreed to under duress. He spoke briefly to the Reverend Clement, more briefly to Dr. Philip Lorimer, the village's recently appointed young physician, who had the unfortunate habit of looking as though he found everything faintly amusing, and not at all to Miss Edith Plummer, whom he passed at a distance of approximately 4 feet, without any alteration of expression whatsoever. It was, Miss Marple reflected, a very deliberate form of not looking at someone. She had known Colonel Hartley Cross for the better part of a decade, or rather, she had known of him, which in a village of this size amounts to nearly the same thing. He had returned from Ceylon in 1948, following the death of his wife under circumstances that were spoken of in St. Mary Mead with the careful vagueness reserved for things that are considered too unpleasant to examine directly. He had taken up residence at Hartley House, a large and somewhat cheerless property on the eastern edge of the village, and had installed his elderly mother in the west wing, along with, 14 months ago, a paid companion by the name of Miss Edith Plummer. Mrs. Hartley Cross Senior had died in February. She had been 83 and had suffered from a weak heart. Dr. Lorimer had signed the certificate without hesitation. Miss Marple had sent a very correct letter of condolence and had noted with private precision that Miss Plummer had not been mentioned in the obituary notice in the Gazette. It was at 1:20 that Mr. Gerald Fettle collapsed. He was not an important man in the way that villagers measure importance. He held no office, chaired no committee, and had never, to anyone's knowledge, won anything at the tombola. He was 61 years old, a retired clerk from the county council offices in Much Benham, and he had lived in the same terraced cottage on Vicarage Lane for 37 years. He was the sort of man whose primary social function, Miss Marple had always felt, was to be present, to fill a chair at the parish council meeting, to make up numbers at the harvest supper, to confirm by his reliable attendance that the village was still the size it believed itself to be. He had taken 2 cups of tea and at some point during the preceding hour 1 spoonful of sugar from the windmill bowl. He rose from his chair at the edge of the crowd, took 3 steps in no particular direction, and sat down again very suddenly on the grass, with the expression of a man who has been surprised by something internal and cannot decide whether it is serious. By the time Dr. Lorimer reached him, Mr. Fettle's face had taken on the waxy yellowish pallor of old piano keys, and his pulse, as Lorimer would note later in his careful, unhurried handwriting, was irregular and diminishing. He was dead before the ambulance reached the village boundary. The Reverend Clement said a brief and decent prayer over him, kneeling in the grass without apparent concern for his trousers. The crowd drew back in that instinctive, guilty way that crowds do, as though proximity to the fact of death might constitute some form of complicity. Miss Marple did not draw back. She was looking at the refreshment table, at the windmill sugar bowl sitting precisely where it had been left, at the silver tongs resting beside it at a slight angle, not the angle at which they had been placed that morning, at the small, faint smudge on the porcelain rim that might have been a thumbprint and might have been nothing at all. And then she looked at Miss Edith Plummer, who was standing quite still at the edge of the retreating crowd, her grey cotton dress entirely unruffled, her hands folded neatly at her waist. Miss Plummer was not looking at Mr. Fettle. She was not looking at the doctor, or the reverend, or the gathering knot of distressed villagers. She was looking at Colonel Hartley Cross, and Colonel Hartley Cross, for the first time that afternoon, was looking directly back at her. Chapter 3. The Doctor's Window. Dr. Philip Lorimer had the kind of face that inspired confidence in waiting rooms and mild unease everywhere else. He was 34, which was considered by the older residents of St. Mary Mead to be a deeply suspicious age for a physician, old enough to have completed his training, young enough to have retained opinions about it. He had come to the village 18 months ago from a practice in Swindon, and had brought with him a motor car that was too fast for the lanes, a filing system that was too modern for the surgery, and a general air of quiet amusement at the world that the Reverend Clement had once described, in a moment of uncharacteristic precision, as the smile of a man who considers himself the only adult in the room. He had nonetheless a good pair of hands and a genuine, if occasionally impatient, concern for his patients. Miss Marple had decided, after careful consideration, that he was probably honest. She had also decided that honesty and perceptiveness were not, in his case, the same thing. He was standing now at the edge of the green, speaking to Police Constable Hodges, who had arrived on his bicycle 7 minutes after the ambulance, and was writing things in his notebook with the laborious care of a man who's been taught that thoroughness and slowness are the same virtue. Miss Marple had positioned herself near the tombola table, which provided an excellent vantage point and the additional social camouflage of appearing to examine a basket of bath salts that she had absolutely no intention of winning. She could not hear the conversation. She could, however, observe it. Dr. Lorimer spoke with his hands in his pockets and his weight on his back foot. The posture of a man delivering information he considers unambiguous. He glanced once toward the body, which had been discreetly covered with a tablecloth by Mrs. Brent from the Women's Institute, and then back to Constable Hodges with an expression of settled professional certainty. Natural causes, then, or so he intended to say. Miss Marple set down the bath salts. She found her opportunity 20 minutes later, when the crowd had thinned sufficiently to permit movement without attracting attention, and Dr. Lorimer had detached himself from Constable Hodges and was making his way toward the refreshment table with the purposeful step of a man in need of something stronger than he was likely to find there. "Dr. Lorimer," she said at his elbow in the gentle and slightly apologetic tone she had perfected over 6 decades of being underestimated. "I do hope I'm not interrupting. I only wanted to ask, poor Mr. Fettle, was it his heart, do you think?" Lorimer turned to her with the expression of a man who has just noticed a sparrow addressing him in complete sentences. "Miss Marple," he said, with the particular warmth reserved for elderly ladies who are considered harmless. "I'm afraid I can't discuss the details. But yes, Mr. Fettle had a history of cardiac irregularities. It's a very sad business, but not, I think, an unexpected one." "No," said Miss Marple thoughtfully. "No, I suppose not. Though I must say he seemed quite well when he arrived this morning. I noticed him particularly. He walked from Vicarage Lane without his stick, which he has needed all winter. I remarked on it to myself. People often have good days," said Lorimer, in the tone of a man closing a subject. "Yes," agreed Miss Marple, "and sometimes, of course, the good day is the last one. Digitalis has that quality, I believe. One feels quite well, and then one doesn't feel anything at all." There was a pause of precisely the right length to be uncomfortable. Lorimer looked at her. The expression of polite dismissal had shifted by 1 or 2 degrees into something more alert. "That's a rather specific observation," he said. "Is it?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. I have a friend, a retired pharmacist in Lymington, who once explained it to me in some detail. She said the difficulty with digitalis poisoning is that it produces symptoms almost identical to a cardiac event, particularly in patients with an existing history. She paused. Mr. Fettle did have an existing history, I take it. His records are confidential, said Lorimer. Of course they are, said Miss Marple warmly. I wouldn't dream of suggesting otherwise. She smiled at him with the serene goodwill of someone who has already obtained everything she came for, and turned her attention to the refreshment table. The windmill sugar bowl was still there. This surprised her, faintly. She had half expected it to have been removed. But then, removal would require intention, and intention requires a person who believes there is something to remove. Constable Hodges had not looked at the refreshment table. Dr. Lorimer had not looked at the refreshment table. The Women's Institute ladies who had begun the quiet, respectful work of dismantling the picnic had moved around it with the automatic deference granted to anything that appears to belong to someone else. Miss Marple looked at the bowl for a long moment. Then she took a clean handkerchief from her cardigan pocket, the good one, with the embroidered edge that had been a Christmas gift from her niece Joan, and used it to lift the silver tongs very carefully from their resting place. She examined the hinge. She set them down again. She looked at the smudge on the porcelain rim. A thumbprint, yes. The pad of a thumb, not the tip. Consistent with someone gripping the bowl from below rather than reaching into it from above. The grip of someone lifting rather than pouring, or steadying, or introducing something while appearing to do neither. She replaced the handkerchief in her pocket. "Elderflower cordial," said a voice beside her. She turned. It was Miss Edith Plummer, holding a glass jug with both hands, her expression one of perfectly calibrated social pleasantness, the kind that sits on the face of someone who has spent years learning to appear unthreatening. "How very kind," said Miss Marple, holding out her cup. Miss Plummer poured with a steady hand. "Dreadful business," said Miss Plummer in a voice carefully tuned to the frequency of mild communal distress. "Very dreadful," agreed Miss Marple. "Poor Mr. Fettle. I barely knew him, of course. One sees a face at church, one exchanges a word or two, but one doesn't really know a person, does one?" "No," said Miss Marple. "One very often doesn't." She sipped her cordial, her own cordial, she noted with a faint private amusement, from one of the 3 bottles she had brought that morning, and watched Miss Plummer's hands as she set the jug down on the table. Steady, quite remarkably steady, for a woman standing 4 feet from the instrument of a man's death. "You were companion to Mrs. Hartley Cross, I believe," said Miss Marple conversationally. Something moved behind Miss Plummer's eyes. Very briefly, the way a fish moves beneath still water, there and then not there. "That's right," she said. "For just over a year. A very gentle lady. And you remain at Hartley House still?" "For the present," said Miss Plummer carefully. "The Colonel has been very accommodating." Miss Marple nodded with the warm vagueness of someone filing that particular word in a drawer marked to be examined later. "How fortunate," she said, "for you both." Chapter 4. The Ledger of Small Kindnesses. There is a particular quality to an English village in the hours following an unexpected death that is quite unlike any other social atmosphere Miss Marple had encountered in a long and attentive life. It is not grief, precisely. Grief requires an intimacy that St. Mary Mead, for all its neighbourly customs, had not quite achieved with Gerald Fettle. It is not shock either, though shock makes a reliable early appearance, and is generously distributed among those with the least claim to it. What settles over a village in these hours is something older and more instinctive, a collective drawing together, a closing of ranks, a quiet and largely unconscious agreement to present a unified surface to whatever comes next. Miss Marple had observed this phenomenon many times. She found it, depending entirely on the circumstances, either deeply comforting or profoundly dangerous. This afternoon she found it the latter. She had returned home at 3:30, made herself a pot of proper tea, the picnic variety having been, in several respects, unsatisfactory, and sat in her usual chair by the garden window with her knitting in her lap, and her mind moving at a pace that would have startled anyone who assumed the knitting was the primary activity. By 4 o'clock she had established to her own satisfaction the following. Gerald Fettle had been a man without enemies in the conventional sense. He had been too unremarkable to inspire hatred, too careful to inspire envy, and too solitary to inspire the particular resentments that cluster around people who involve themselves too enthusiastically in other people's arrangements. He had lived alone since the death of his sister Agnes in 1951. He had attended church with regularity, paid his rates without complaint, and kept a small but well-maintained vegetable garden that his neighbour Mrs. Horsfall had occasionally admired over the fence. He was, in short, exactly the sort of man who should have died peacefully in his own bed at a reasonable age, surrounded by whatever small comforts a bachelor of modest means accumulates over a lifetime of careful living. He was not the sort of man who should have died on the village green at 1:20 on a Saturday afternoon 4 feet from a windmill sugar bowl, unless, of course, he was not intended to. Miss Marple set down her knitting and looked out at the garden. The roses needed attention. They always needed attention at this time of year. There was a black spot on the Madame Alfred Carrière that she had been meaning to address for a fortnight, and the ground elder was making its usual ambitious encroachment along the south border. These were facts she noted and set aside, in the way that one sets aside the entirely reasonable demands of ordinary life when something more pressing presents itself. The question she was turning over, carefully, the way one turns over a stone in a garden to examine what lives beneath it without disturbing the larger arrangement, was not who had placed something in the sugar bowl, though that was certainly a question. It was a prior and in some ways more fundamental question. Who had been intended to reach that bowl? Gerald Fettle had taken sugar. She had observed that herself at approximately 12:40, when she had watched him cross to the refreshment table, with the slightly self-conscious air of a man performing a small indulgence, 1 spoonful, no more. But Gerald Fettle was not, she was increasingly certain, the target. He was a man of habit. She knew this not from personal acquaintance, but from the particular kind of knowledge that accumulates in small communities like sediment, slowly, invisibly, and with a comprehensiveness that no formal investigation can quite replicate. She knew that he took sugar in his tea at home because Mrs. Horsfall had mentioned it once in conversation outside the post office, in the context of remarking that the price of sugar was becoming perfectly unreasonable for a man living alone. She knew that he walked to the green from Vicarage Lane, which meant he would have arrived thirsty and taken his tea early. She also knew, and this was the piece that had been sitting at the edge of her attention since 20 minutes past 1, that the windmill bowl had been positioned at the left end of the refreshment table when Mrs. Clement arranged it that morning. Miss Marple had noticed it there at 10:30. By the time Mr. Fettle visited the table, the bowl was at the centre. Someone had moved it. The knock at her door came at 5:05. She had been expecting it, not from any particular prescience, but from the reliable observation that people who have something on their conscience tend, in the hours following a death, to seek out the company of someone they believe to be safe. Safe, in this context, meaning unlikely to understand them. It was Dr. Lorimer. He stood on her doorstep with his hat in his hands and an expression she had not seen on his face before. The expression of a man who has been carrying something at arm's length, and has begun to find it heavy. "Miss Marple," he said, "I hope this isn't an inconvenient time." "Not at all," she said, and stood back to let him in with the unhurried grace of a woman who has been expecting precisely this visitor. She put the kettle on. She settled him into the chair across from her own, with a cup of Darjeeling and a slice of seed cake, and she waited with the patience of someone who understands that the most important part of a conversation is very often what precedes it. He turned his cup in his hands for a moment without drinking from it. "I've been thinking," he said, "about what you said this afternoon, about digitalis." "Have you?" said Miss Marple pleasantly. "It isn't. That is to say, I want to be clear that my initial assessment was made in good faith. Fettle had a documented history. The presentation was entirely consistent with—" He stopped, began again. "I requested the ambulance crew to note the time of death provisionally. I haven't yet filed the certificate." Miss Marple looked at him over her teacup. "That was very prudent of you," she said. "I've been thinking," he said again, and this time he did not follow it with anything for almost a full minute, which Miss Marple found considerably more informative than anything he might have said. "Mrs. Hartley Cross," he said finally, "the Colonel's mother. I signed that certificate without—" Another stop. "She had a weak heart. It was entirely— There was no reason at the time to—" "No," said Miss Marple gently. "There very rarely is the first time." Lorimer looked up at her sharply. "The first time," he said. "Dr. Lorimer," said Miss Marple, setting down her cup with the quiet authority of someone moving a chess piece into a position they have been planning for some time, "I think you had better. Tell me everything you remember about Mrs. Hartley Cross's final week. Every detail, however small. The small ones are very often the ones that matter most." He looked at her for a long moment, the look of a man recalibrating, adjusting his estimation of the sparrow who has just addressed him in complete sentences. Then he set down his cup, folded his hands in his lap, and began to talk. Outside, the garden fell into its early evening quiet. The roses cast long shadows across the lawn. The black spot on the Madame Alfred Carrière waited patiently for another day. And in the sitting-room of a small house on the edge of St. Mary Mead, a young doctor with good hands and a newly awakened conscience spoke carefully and at length to an old woman with a knitting basket and a ledger of small observations that was, page by page, beginning to fill. Chapter 5. The Companion's Corner. Dr. Lorimer left at 6:30, having drunk 2 cups of Darjeeling and eaten 3 slices of seed cake with the abstracted industry of a man who is feeding himself without noticing it. He had told her a great deal. He had told her that Mrs. Harriet Hartley Cross, aged 83, had been in declining but stable health from October through January, the ordinary unremarkable decline of a woman of her age, with a documented cardiac history and a constitution that had been, by all accounts, considerably more robust in its youth. He had told her that in the final 10 days of January, that decline had accelerated in a manner he had attributed at the time to the cold weather, the reduced mobility of winter, and the general tendency of very old people to choose the darkest part of the year for their departure. He had told her, with the careful precision of a man constructing a retroactive case against himself, that he had visited Hartley House 4 times in Mrs. Hartley Cross's final week, that on each visit Miss Edith Plummer had been present in the room, that on each visit Miss Plummer had offered him tea, answered his questions about the patient's symptoms with a fluency and detail that he had taken for devoted attention, and had shown him out with a solicitousness he had found, he admitted now, rather agreeable. He had told her that he had not, on any of these 4 visits, spoken to Mrs. Hartley Cross alone. Miss Marple had said very little during all of this. She had nodded at intervals and refilled his cup and kept her expression at the precise temperature of sympathetic attention, warm enough to encourage, neutral enough not to direct. She had learned long ago that a person unburdening themselves requires an audience, not a participant. It was only when he had gone that she allowed herself to think. She slept well, as she generally did, the particular good conscience of someone who has done what the day required and left tomorrow's requirements for tomorrow, and rose at her customary 6:30 to find the morning overcast and purposeful, the sky the colour of unbleached linen, with the kind of flat light that makes an English garden look like a pencil sketch of itself. She had decided in the productive interval between waking and rising that she used for thinking that it was time to call on Miss Edith Plummer. The social pretext was straightforward. Miss Marple had known Mrs. Hartley Cross in the amiable, nodding fashion of 2 women who have attended the same church for many years without ever quite becoming friends, a relationship perfectly calibrated for a condolence visit that was several months overdue. She would bring a pot of her elderflower cordial. She would apologise for the tardiness of the call. She would be exactly as harmless as Miss Plummer expected her to be. She put on her good cardigan, the blue one, not the lavender, and set out for Hartley House, at 10:10. Hartley House sat at the end of a long gravel drive behind a screen of copper beeches that had been magnificent once and were now merely large. The house itself was Georgian in its bones and Victorian in its additions, with the slightly aggrieved expression of a building that has been improved upon too many times by people with insufficient understanding of what was already there. The garden was tidy in a way that suggested professional maintenance rather than personal affection. The hedges clipped, the beds weeded, but nothing in flower that had not been planted specifically to flower, and nothing allowed to grow in any direction that had not been predetermined. Miss Marple noted this as she crunched up the drive. A garden tells you a great deal about the people who inhabit the house behind it, and this one told her that the current occupant of Hartley House valued control considerably more than beauty. It was Miss Plummer who answered the door. She was dressed, as she had been at the picnic, in grey, a different grey, slightly darker, with a white collar that had the look of something added to soften an effect that could not otherwise be softened. Her hair was neat. Her expression, upon seeing Miss Marple on the doorstep with a pot of cordial and an apologetic smile, moved through several rapid adjustments, before settling on something that resembled welcome. "Miss Marple," she said, what a kind surprise." "I do hope I'm not intruding," said Miss Marple warmly. I've been meaning to call for months to offer my condolences about dear Mrs. Hartley Cross. I'm afraid the winter rather got the better of me, and then one thing leads to another. You know how it is." "Of course," said Miss Plummer. "Please do come in." The interior of Hartley House had the atmosphere of a place that had been recently and thoroughly tidied, in a way that goes somewhat beyond cleanliness, the kind of tidying that removes not just disorder but personality. The hall was clean and dim and smelled of beeswax and something faintly medicinal beneath it, that Miss Marple identified after a moment as the particular staleness of rooms that have been closed for longer than is quite healthy. She was shown into a sitting room on the left, not, she noted, the drawing room at the end of the hall, which would have been the natural choice for a guest, but a smaller, more defensible room with 2 chairs and a low table, and a window that looked out onto the side passage rather than the garden. The room of a person who prefers to receive visitors in spaces where they feel contained. Miss Plummer made tea with the efficient movements of someone for whom tea-making has long since ceased to be a social gesture and become an operational one, the kettle already boiled, the cups already set, as though she had been expecting, if not Miss Marple specifically, then the general category of visitor that Miss Marple represented. "It must have been a very difficult winter for you," said Miss Marple, accepting her cup. "Losing Mrs. Hartley Cross, and then—" "Well, yesterday was a dreadful business too, poor Mr. Fettle." "Yes," said Miss Plummer, "very sad." "Did you know him well?" "Hardly at all." The answer came a fraction of a second too quickly. Not enough to be obvious, enough to be noted. "One sees people about the village, of course." "Of course," agreed Miss Marple. "He was a quiet man. I don't think he had a great deal of family, no one to take a particular interest in his affairs." Something shifted in Miss Plummer's posture. Almost nothing. The faint adjustment of a person who has received information they were hoping for, and is being careful not to show that they were hoping for it. "I believe not," she said. Miss Marple sipped her tea and looked around the room, with the benign curiosity of a woman admiring her surroundings. Her eye moved over the mantelpiece at a carriage clock, a small watercolour of the Lake District, a framed photograph turned slightly away from the room's centre. She looked at the writing desk in the corner, on which sat a leather-bound notebook, closed, with a pen laid precisely across its cover. She looked at the grate, in which a small fire had been lit despite the mildness of the morning. A fire in June. People lit fires in June for one of 2 reasons in Miss Marple's experience. Either they were very cold, or they had been burning things. "It's very good of the Colonel to have allowed you to remain at Hartley House," she said pleasantly, "after Mrs. Hartley Cross passed. I imagine it gave you both some comfort, in the circumstances." The pause before Miss Plummer answered was 3 seconds long. Miss Marple counted them, as she counted most things. "The Colonel has been very kind," said Miss Plummer, and there it was again. Kind. The same word she had used on the village green, in the same careful tone with the same quality of meaning, something adjacent to what it said, the way a locked door is adjacent to the room it conceals. Miss Marple set down her cup and smiled with the full warmth of a woman who has just found, in an apparently empty room, exactly what she came to look for. "Another cup," said Miss Plummer. "How lovely," said Miss Marple. "Yes, please." Chapter 6. The Colonel's Arithmetic. Miss Marple walked home from Hartley House by the long way. This was not laziness, nor was it the vagueness that younger people sometimes attributed to her when she moved at a pace they considered insufficiently purposeful. It was a deliberate choice. The long way took her along the eastern edge of the village, past the church, past the old rectory wall with its satisfying accumulation of moss, and down a narrow lane that ran behind the properties on Vicarage Lane, which meant that it ran, at one particular point, directly behind the terraced cottage that had belonged to Gerald Fettle. She paused at the gate in the back wall. The garden was small and extraordinarily neat, the vegetable beds turned and planted with the methodical precision she had heard attributed to him, the paths edged with the particular care of a man who has limited space and chooses to treat that limitation as a discipline rather than a deprivation. A pair of garden gloves hung on the gatepost. A trowel leaned against the cold frame. Everything exactly where it had been left by a man who had expected to return to it. Miss Marple stood at the gate for a moment in the flat morning light and felt the specific quiet sadness that attaches not to dramatic deaths but to interrupted ones. The lives that stop in the middle of a sentence, with the washing still on the line and the trowel still leaning, and everything waiting for a person who is not coming back. Then she straightened her cardigan and walked on. She had been home for 20 minutes and had begun a letter to her niece Joan that she had no intention of finishing that morning when the Colonel called. He did not knock so much as announce himself. 3 sharp raps on the front door with what she suspected was the handle of his walking stick, with the air of a man who expects doors to open promptly and finds it faintly unreasonable when they do not. She opened it herself, her housekeeper, Mrs. Brent, being occupied with the laundry. Colonel Aubrey Hartley Cross in her doorway was a different proposition from Colonel Hartley Cross observed, at a distance across a village green. He was larger, for one thing, not in height, which was merely average, but in the particular density of a man accustomed to occupying space without apology. His face, at close range, had the quality of a landscape that has weathered badly. The features regular beneath the surface damage, the eyes, she noted, rather more intelligent than his manner invited one to expect. "Miss Marple," he said, not a question. "Colonel Hartley Cross," she said. "Do come in." He sat in the chair Dr. Lorimer had occupied the previous evening with the differently held rigidity of a man whose formality is a matter of habit rather than discomfort. He refused tea. He placed his hat on his knee and his stick against the arm of the chair, and looked at her with the directness of a man who has decided that directness is the most efficient available strategy. "I understand you had a conversation with Philip Lorimer yesterday afternoon," he said, "and that you called on Miss Plummer this morning." "I did," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "I want to know," he said, "what you're about." It was bluntly put, and she appreciated that. In her experience, bluntness from a man like the Colonel was rarely rudeness. It was a form of respect, extended grudgingly to someone he has decided, against his initial assessment, is worth the directness. "I am about the truth," she said, with equal simplicity, "as I generally am." He looked at her for a moment. Something moved in his expression, a brief, interior reckoning, the adjustment of a man who has arrived prepared for one kind of conversation and found himself in another. "Fettle," he said. "Among other things," said Miss Marple. The Colonel was silent for a moment. He looked down at his hat, then back at her with the expression of a man who has been carrying a weight for long enough that the muscles have adapted to it, and the prospect of setting it down is more alarming than continuing to carry it. "I want you to understand something," he said. "Miss Plummer came to Hartley House as my mother's companion. She was engaged through an agency. I had very little to do with the selection. My mother made the arrangement herself through correspondence." He paused. "She was attentive to my mother. Very attentive. My mother was fond of her." "And you?" said Miss Marple. "I found her efficient," he said, in the tone of a man describing something he has revised his opinion of. "When did you begin to find her less so?" said Miss Marple. Another pause, longer. The Colonel's grip on his hat tightened fractionally. "After my mother died," he said, "I discovered certain irregularities in the household accounts, small amounts, over a period of months. The sort of thing that is very easy to overlook when one is not looking for it, and very obvious once one is." He stopped. "I said nothing at the time. I told myself it was manageable, that to make a fuss would be unseemly, that my mother had liked her, and perhaps that counted for something." Miss Marple said nothing. She had the particular stillness of someone who understands that the most important part of a confession is the part the confessor has not yet reached. "She stayed on," he said. "I told myself it was temporary, that she would find another position, that the situation would resolve itself." His jaw tightened. It did not resolve itself. She made it very clear that she considered her position at Hartley House to be permanent. She did not say so directly. She is not a direct woman, but she made it clear. "Through what means?" said Miss Marple gently. The Colonel looked at her with an expression that was, beneath the weathered surface, something close to shame. "She knew things," he said, "about my mother's final weeks, about certain decisions regarding medication. She had been the one administering it, you understand, under Lorimer's instructions, but she was the one in the room. She suggested, on one occasion, in a conversation that was very carefully constructed to be deniable, that a person in her position might notice things, that a devoted companion observes a great deal." "I see," said Miss Marple. "I am not a foolish man," said the Colonel, with a heat that suggested he had been feeling like one for some time. "I am not a man who is easily managed, but I found myself in a position I had not anticipated and did not know how to leave without consequences I was not prepared for." without her saying publicly what she had implied privately, said Miss Marple. Yes, he said. It came out with the relief of a word that has been held in too long. Miss Marple looked at him steadily for a moment, not unkindly, but with the clear-eyed precision of someone taking an accurate measurement. Colonel, she said, I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer me with equal directness. Did Miss Plummer, to your knowledge, have any reason to wish harm to Gerald Fettle? The Colonel frowned. Genuine puzzlement. She was fairly certain of it. Fettle? He said. I can't imagine why. I barely knew the man. But Miss Plummer knew him, said Miss Marple. It was not a question. The Colonel's frown deepened. She may have done. I don't know the particulars of her. I don't know who she knew in the village before she came to us. He stopped. Then slowly, with the expression of a man watching something assemble itself against his will. There was a letter, shortly after she arrived. She received a letter that... She was not pleased by it. I remember thinking it was unusual because she was generally very composed. She burned it in the library grate. Miss Marple thought of the fire in the sitting room at Hartley House, burning in June. Did you see the envelope? She said. Only the postmark, said the Colonel. Much Benham. County Council offices, I think, the franking mark. Gerald Fettle, retired clerk. County Council offices, much Benham. Miss Marple sat very still for a moment, in the way she sat when several things that have been moving in parallel finally converge. Colonel Hartley Cross, she said, with a gentleness that was entirely genuine and contained beneath it, the unyielding quality of something very old and very certain. I think it is time you told me everything, from the beginning, and I think when we are finished, we will need to place a telephone call to someone considerably more senior than Constable Hodges. The Colonel looked at her across the small quiet room, then he put his hat on the table beside him with the deliberate finality of a man disarming himself, and he began. Chapter 7. The Much Benham Ledger. The Colonel talked for the better part of an hour. He talked with the careful, effortful precision of a man who has spent a long time not talking, constructing each sentence with the slightly over-deliberate quality of someone who has rehearsed silence so thoroughly that speech has become unfamiliar territory. He repeated himself occasionally, circled back, corrected a detail here and there with the scrupulousness of someone for whom accuracy has always been a point of professional honour, even when the facts being accurately reported are not ones he is proud of. Miss Marple listened. She knitted, not from inattention, but because she'd long ago discovered that people speak more freely to a woman who appears to be doing something else, and because the rhythm of the needles had a settling effect on conversations that might otherwise become too large for the room they were happening in. What emerged over the course of that hour was the following. Miss Edith Plummer had not, it transpired, arrived in St. Mary Mead by accident. She had come, or so the Colonel had pieced together slowly, over the months since his mother's death, from a specific direction, with a specific knowledge, and with a patience that was, when one examined it clearly, not the patience of a devoted companion, but the patience of a person who has identified a position worth occupying and is prepared to wait as long as necessary for it to become permanent. She had known, before she arrived, that Mrs. Hartley Cross was wealthy, was elderly, was in declining health, and, most importantly, was the kind of woman who valued personal loyalty above almost every other quality and was likely to reward it accordingly. She had known this, the Colonel believed, because she had known Gerald Fettle. Fettle, it emerged, had spent 31 years as a records clerk in the Estates and Probate Division of the much Benham County Council offices, a position of almost perfect invisibility that had, nonetheless, brought him into regular contact with a remarkable quantity of sensitive financial information. Wills, property transfers, probate valuations, the kind of documentation that passes through a county office unremarked upon by almost everyone, except the clerk who files it, and, occasionally, someone who has cultivated that clerk's acquaintance for precisely that purpose. He had been, by all accounts, an honest man. Miss Marple was fairly certain of this, not from sentiment, but from the particular character of his garden and the way his neighbours spoke of him, which are two of the more reliable indicators of a man's fundamental nature. He had been honest, and he had been lonely, and he had been, at some point in the last several years, befriended by a woman who was neither. What Fettle had known, what he had, in a moment of misguided confidence, communicated to Miss Plummer, was that the Hartley Cross estate was, considerably larger than it appeared, that Mrs. Hartley Cross Senior had made recent and significant alterations to her will, and that the Colonel's own financial position was, in certain respects, less secure than the house on the end of the drive suggested. He had not, Miss Marple suspected, understood what he was providing. He had understood it later, hence the letter. "What was in it?" she asked, when the Colonel paused at this point. "The letter she burned. Did she tell you?" "No," said the Colonel, "but she was altered after it arrived, less settled, more watchful." He frowned at the middle distance. I think he was warning her, or threatening her, or both. "And shortly after that," said Miss Marple, "Gerald Fettle died at the Parish Picnic." "Yes," said the Colonel. The word fell into the room with a weight that required no elaboration. Miss Marple set down her knitting. She looked out at the garden for a moment, the black spot on the Madame Alfred Carrière, still waiting, the ground elder still advancing with its cheerful indifference to human concerns. And then she looked back at the Colonel with the expression that her nephew Raymond, had he been present, would have recognised as the one she wore when she'd finished assembling a picture and was examining it for the last remaining gaps. There were two. The first was the question of how. She was fairly certain of the mechanism, the windmill sugar bowl, the 8 or 10 seconds with her back to the crowd. The thumbprint on the porcelain consistent with lifting rather than reaching. The substance would need to be confirmed by analysis, and Constable Hodges would need to be persuaded, firmly and by someone with more authority than herself, to ensure the bowl was preserved before Mrs. Clement's Women's Institute colleagues dismantled the last of the picnic tables. She made a mental note to telephone Inspector Craddock in Much Benham directly after the Colonel left. Craddock was young and occasionally impatient, but he was not, unlike certain of his colleagues, constitutionally incapable of listening to an elderly woman with a knitting basket. The second gap was more interesting. It was the question of why Gerald Fettle specifically. Why, that is, he had needed to die rather than simply be managed. Discredited or silenced or bought, in the way that inconvenient people are more commonly silenced when outright elimination involves the risks that outright elimination invariably involves. She turned this over for a moment. "Colonel," she said, "the alterations to your mother's will, the ones Mr. Fettle had access to through his professional records. Do you know the nature of those alterations?" The Colonel's expression shifted in a way that told her, before he spoke, that this was the part he had been hoping to reach last. "My mother," he said, "added a codicil in November. 4 months before she died." He paused. "She left Miss Plummer a specific bequest, £1,200 and the use of the East Cottage on the Hartley House grounds for the duration of her natural life." "And Mr. Fettle would have had access to this codicil through the probate process," said Miss Marple. "Yes, he would have known it existed. He would also have known—" The Colonel stopped. His expression was that of a man swallowing something unpleasant with determined thoroughness. He would also have known that the codicil contained an exclusion clause, standard language in such documents. "I'm told it is quite routine. The bequest would be void in the event that Miss Plummer was found to have acted contrary to the interests of the estate or its principal beneficiaries." Miss Marple looked at him. "In the event, for example, that she was found to have misappropriated household funds," she said. "Yes," said the Colonel quietly, "which you had discovered she had done." "Yes." "And which Mr. Fettle, as a records clerk familiar with the codicil's terms, may have realised gave him, or gave you, a means of voiding her claim entirely." The Colonel said nothing. He did not need to. Miss Marple sat for a moment in the particular quality of silence that arrives when the last piece of a picture settles into position and the whole becomes, for the first time, entirely visible. It was, she reflected, a very old arithmetic. The arithmetic of people who believe they have secured their future and discover, too late, that the security they have arranged rests upon the silence of someone who has decided they are no longer willing to be silent. Fettle had not been threatening Miss Plummer for his own gain. She was increasingly certain of that. He had been, as the Colonel had guessed, warning her that he intended to speak, perhaps to the Colonel, perhaps to a solicitor, perhaps simply to someone, out of the belated and costly conscience of a man who has spent 31 years handling other people's paperwork honestly and cannot, in the end, be party to what that paperwork has been used to enable. He had given her, she supposed, the opportunity to stop, to leave quietly, to forgo the bequest, to disappear from St. Mary Mead before anything was formally set in motion. She had chosen a different resolution. "Colonel," said Miss Marple, rising from her chair with the deliberate, unhurried movement of someone who has decided what needs to be done, and sees no reason to delay doing it. "I am going to telephone Inspector Craddock. I would ask you to remain here until he arrives, if you're willing." The Colonel rose also, reflexively the old courtesy, and stood with his hat in his hands and his stick against the chair. "Will it?" he started, stopped, tried again. "My mother's name, the business with the accounts, and the codicil. Will it all have to come out?" Miss Marple looked at him with the measured compassion of someone who has never found the truth comfortable but has always found it, in the end, preferable to the alternative. "I am afraid," she said gently, "that it generally does." He nodded. Once. The nod of a man accepting a verdict he has known, on some level, was coming. Miss Marple went to the telephone. Chapter 8. Inspector Craddock arrives. Inspector Dermot Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage at 3:20 in a motor car that was slightly too large for the lane, and a mood that was slightly too controlled to be entirely natural. He was 38, lean in the manner of a man who forgets to eat when thinking, with a long angular face and the kind of dark, attentive eyes that missed rather less than his deliberately unhurried manner suggested. He had worked with Miss Marple on 2 previous occasions, or rather she had worked alongside him, which was a different thing, and one that he had taken longer to appreciate than he would now care to admit. He had learned, in the intervening years, to approach her sitting room with the same careful respect he applied to a crime scene, attending to details, resisting premature conclusions, and suppressing, as firmly as possible, the instinct to explain things to her. He greeted Colonel Hartley Cross with professional courtesy and the additional wariness of a man assessing a witness who has had time to compose himself. He accepted tea, though he did not drink it. He sat in the chair that had now accommodated, in the space of 24 hours, Dr. Lorimer, Colonel Hartley Cross, and now himself. A chair that Miss Marple privately considered to be doing excellent work. He listened. She told him methodically and without embellishment. The sugar bowl, the thumbprint, the position of the tongs, the 8 or 10 seconds with the back turned, the fire burning in June, the letter postmark much Benham, the codicil and its exclusion clause, the household accounts and their irregularities, Mrs. Hartley Cross and her 4 final visits from a doctor who had never once been left alone with his patient. Craddock listened with the focused stillness of a man who is filing and cross-referencing simultaneously. He asked 4 questions, all of them good ones, the kind that confirmed he had understood not just the facts but the architecture beneath them. When she had finished, he was quiet for a moment. "The sugar bowl," he said. "You're certain it hasn't been removed?" "I am not certain of anything regarding its current location," said Miss Marple precisely. "I left the picnic at 3:30 yesterday afternoon. The Women's Institute ladies were beginning to clear. I would recommend some urgency on that particular point." Craddock was already reaching for his hat. "Sergeant Trent is in the village," he said. "I'll have him go directly." He paused, with his hand on the hat and his eyes on Miss Marple. "The substance, you believe it was digitalis?" "I believe it is consistent with digitalis poisoning," said Miss Marple. "I am not a chemist. That is rather more your department than mine." The corner of his mouth moved in a way that, on a less controlled face, would have been a smile. "Quite," he said. He was back within the hour. Sergeant Trent, a solid, reliable young man, from much Benham, who had the great professional virtue of doing precisely what he was told, without adding interpretations of his own, had located the windmill sugar bowl in a cardboard box in the back of Mrs. Clement's estate car, where it had been placed by a Women's Institute volunteer who had assumed it belonged to the vicarage. It had been sealed in an evidence bag with commendable speed and dispatched to the county laboratory, with a priority request that Craddock had authorised with the quiet authority of a man who has learned when to spend his professional credit and when to save it. He returned to Miss Marple's sitting room and lowered himself into the chair with the air of a man settling in for the longer conversation. Colonel Hartley Cross had not left. He sat in the corner with his hat on his knee and the expression of a man waiting for a train he is not looking forward to boarding. Resigned, and slightly relieved that the waiting at least is nearly over, "The Colonel has given me a written account of the household accounts discrepancy," said Miss Marple, "and of the letter." Craddock looked at the Colonel. "You're prepared to make a formal statement to that effect?" "I am," said the Colonel. The words had the quality of something decided some time ago and only now being spoken aloud. "And Miss Plummer is currently at Hartley House." "She was there this morning," said Miss Marple. "She had a fire lit in the sitting-room grate. I would not delay." Craddock went to Hartley House at 4:30 with Sergeant Trent and a careful, specific warrant that had been arranged by telephone with rather more speed than the much Benham magistrate's office generally managed, and which Craddock had achieved by the simple means of explaining the situation with unusual clarity to a clerk named Morrison, who had the intelligence to understand it and the initiative to act upon it. Miss Marple did not go with him. She was not invited and would not have gone. If she had been, not because she had no interest in the outcome, but because she understood, with the precision of long experience, that her role in these matters ends at the point where official machinery begins, and that a good detective knows when to stand aside. She made herself a fresh pot of tea instead, and sat in her garden despite the overcast sky, with her knitting and her thoughts, and waited. She thought about Gerald Fettle and his trowel leaning against the cold frame. She thought about Mrs. Harriet Hartley Cross, 83 years old, dying in the dark of January with a companion in the room, and a doctor who had never been left alone with her. She thought about the particular cruelty of being erased by someone paid to attend to you, the inversion of care into its opposite, performed so smoothly and so patiently that no one, including the victim, had clearly seen it until it was too late to matter. She thought about Gerald Fettle's letter, the man who had, at some cost to himself, decided he could not be silent, who had given warning and received death in return. She thought about Miss Edith Plummer's hands, steady as stone, pouring elderflower cordial 4 feet from a dead man. Craddock returned at 6:15. He came alone. Sergeant Trent had remained at Hartley House, and Miss Plummer had been conveyed to much Benham in a second vehicle, with a quietness that the village would not fully understand until the following morning's telephone calls began circulating. He sat in the chair. He accepted the tea this time and drank it. The grate, he said. There were fragments, partially burned, enough for the document examiner to work with. Trent photographed what he could before it was disturbed. He paused. There was also a small glass vial in the lining of a coat in the wardrobe. Empty, but not recently. The laboratory will confirm. The same wardrobe, said Miss Marple, that a devoted companion would have had unrestricted access to in the course of her duties. Yes, said Craddock. He looked at her across the tea tray with the expression he wore when he was deciding how much to say. The Colonel, he said carefully. His position is complicated. He knew about the accounts. He said nothing. He was frightened, said Miss Marple simply. Not of Miss Plummer personally, I think, but of what she knew, or claimed to know, about his mother's death. He was not certain enough of his own innocence to risk drawing attention to her guilt. You think he was innocent? Of his mother? Miss Marple considered this with the scrupulousness it deserved. I think, she said, that he was a man who did not look closely at things he did not wish to see, which is a very common failing and a very dangerous one, and not quite the same as guilt. She paused, though it is not quite the same as innocence either. Craddock nodded slowly. Miss Plummer has said nothing, he said, since the caution. Nothing at all. No, said Miss Marple, she wouldn't. She said it without bitterness and without surprise. The quiet observation of someone who has met this particular silence before, in other rooms and other faces, and has learned that it is not the silence of a person with nothing to say, but of a person who has decided with great precision to say none of it. Outside, the garden had gone dark. The overcast sky held its flat grey light longer than a clear one would have, stretching the evening out to an indeterminate grey end. The Madame Alfred Carrière was invisible now, the black spot hidden with everything else in the general obscurity of dusk. Tomorrow, Miss Marple thought. She would attend to the roses tomorrow. Chapter 9. The Weight of Ordinary Choices. The news, as news does in a village of St. Mary Mead's dimensions, arrived everywhere simultaneously and from no identifiable source. By 8 o'clock on Sunday morning, before the church bells had begun their first summons and before Mrs. Horsfall had collected her milk from the doorstep, the essential facts had distributed themselves through the village with the silent efficiency of water finding its level. Miss Edith Plummer had been taken to much Benham. There had been police at Hartley House. It concerned the death of Gerald Fettle, and possibly, here the accounts diverged, as accounts always do at their most interesting point. Possibly something else as well. The village received this information in the way that villages receive information that confirms what they have always, on some unexamined level, suspected. Not with shock, precisely, but with the particular satisfaction of a community whose instincts have been vindicated accompanied by the immediate and universal revision of memory that allows everyone to recall in useful detail all the ways in which Miss Plummer had always struck them as not quite right. Mrs. Horsfall remembered a sharpness in her manner when spoken to unexpectedly. Mr. Biggs at the post office recalled that she had never in 14 months received a personal letter from anyone, only official correspondence and once a package from a London pharmacy that she had collected herself rather than having delivered. The Reverend Clement, who had a more rigorous conscience than most and therefore a more uncomfortable morning, admitted to his wife over breakfast that he had always found her expressions of devotion to Mrs. Hartley Cross somewhat performed, was the word he used, and then immediately felt guilty about using it. Miss Marple heard all of this, as she heard most things in St. Mary Mead, without leaving her garden. People came to her, drawn, as they generally were in moments of communal disturbance, by the gravitational pull of someone who appears to understand what is happening and can be relied upon not to make it worse. She received them at the garden gate or in the sitting room over tea, and she listened with equal attention and equal care to all of it, and she said very little, and what she said was never quite what people expected. It was the Reverend Clement who came first at 9:30, having delivered a slightly distracted sermon on the subject of charity that his congregation had attended to with more than usual concentration given the morning's circumstances. He was a tall, thin man with the permanently apologetic posture of someone who has spent 30 years trying to be simultaneously present to everyone, and was finding it, at this particular moment, rather more than usually difficult. He sat in the garden chair that Miss Marple had placed in the shade of the apple tree and held his hat in both hands and looked at the lawn. "I keep thinking," he said, "about the preserve jars." Miss Marple waited. "Dorothy spent 3 weeks on those preserves," he said. She was very proud of them. She had arranged them herself that morning. The sugar bowl was hers as well, from the church hall cupboard, the one with the windmill. She put it out herself. He paused. She has been saying since last night that she feels responsible, that the table was hers to arrange, and that if she had been watching more carefully. "She is not responsible," said Miss Marple firmly. "Not in any meaningful sense. The arrangement of a refreshment table is not an act requiring the anticipation of malice. Mrs. Clement should not torment herself." "No," said the Reverend. "No, I know. But she does, rather." He turned his hat in his hands. "I keep thinking about what it means. That someone could look at a village picnic, at a perfectly ordinary summer gathering, and see in it an instrument, a mechanism." He shook his head. I find it hard to situate within any framework of ordinary human motivation." "Do you?" said Miss Marple, not unkindly. He looked at her. "You don't find it difficult," he said. It was an observation, not an accusation. "I find it very sad," said Miss Marple, "but I do not find it surprising. That, I think, is the honest answer." She was quiet for a moment. "In my experience, Reverend, the most destructive choices are almost never made by people who consider themselves to be making destructive choices. They are made by people who have constructed a private arithmetic, a set of calculations that arrives, by small and individually defensible steps, at a conclusion that would be immediately recognizable as monstrous if it were stated plainly at the outset." The Reverend looked at her with the expression of a man who has asked a question he finds he is not entirely ready for the answer to. "Miss Plummer," said Miss Marple quietly, "did not think of herself, I suspect, as a poisoner. She thought of herself as a person in an impossible position, who was making necessary adjustments. Gerald Fettle was not in her arithmetic a man. He was an obstacle, an inconvenient variable that threatened to overturn a calculation she had spent considerable effort constructing." She paused. "That is what makes it so very dangerous. Not the malice, the reasonableness." The Reverend was silent for a long moment. "That is," he said finally, "a rather chilling observation." "Yes," agreed Miss Marple, "it generally is." Dr. Lorimer came at 11. He looked considerably worse than he had 2 days ago. The sleeplessness was visible in him, the particular grey quality of a man who has spent the night in honest and uncomfortable examination of himself, and has not enjoyed what he found. He did not sit down. He stood in the garden with his hands in his pockets and looked at the roses with the unfocused attention of someone who is not looking at anything. "The laboratory results came through this morning," he said. "Craddock rang me directly. The sugar bowl. There were traces. Consistent with a digitalis compound, he said. They'll need further analysis for the specific form and concentration, but he stopped. But it confirms the mechanism, said Miss Marple. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. I should have. With Mrs. Hartley Cross, I should have. You should have been more careful, said Miss Marple, with the gentleness that does not soften a truth but makes it possible to hear. Yes, you should have been more attentive to the possibility that what presented as natural was not. You were young, and you were certain, and she gave you no reason to look more closely because she was very good at ensuring there was no obvious reason to look. She paused. None of that excuses the oversight, but it does explain it. Those are different things, Lorimer looked at her. Will there be... Craddock said there may be a review of the certificate. There may be, said Miss Marple. I think you should cooperate with it fully and without reservation. And I think that if you do, and if you're honest about what you observed and what you failed to observe, you will find that honesty, in the long run, serves you considerably better than its alternative. He nodded. It was the nod of a man accepting not reassurance but instruction, which is a more useful thing. Miss Marple, he said as he turned to go, how did you... At the picnic, in those first moments, how did you know to look at the sugar bowl? Miss Marple considered this with the genuine thoughtfulness it deserved. I didn't know, she said. I noticed. There is a difference. I noticed a woman standing with her back to a crowd for 8 seconds with no apparent purpose, and I noticed that the quality of her stillness was not the stillness of someone doing nothing. And then I waited, to see what the stillness had been for. She paused. Most people, when they see something that doesn't quite fit, find a comfortable explanation for it and move on. I find, on the whole, that it is more productive to stay with the discomfort for a little while. The discordant note, if you listen to it long enough, generally resolves into something intelligible. Lorimer looked at her for a moment in the flat grey light. You make it sound simple, he said. It is simple, said Miss Marple. It is not, however, easy. That is a distinction most people prefer not to examine too closely. He left. The garden settled back into its quiet. Miss Marple sat for a while longer, with her knitting in her lap and the apple tree moving slightly above her in what had become, by midday, the first suggestion of a proper summer breeze. She thought about Gerald Fettle's vegetable garden, waiting for a man who was not coming back. She thought about Harriet Hartley Cross, 83 years old, and the 4 visits in her final week during which no one had ever been alone with her except the person she trusted most. She thought about the particular weight of ordinary choices, the choice to stay silent, to look away, to find a comfortable explanation for a discordant note and move on. The choice made by decent people in reasonable circumstances that accumulates, by degrees too small to examine individually, into something that cannot be undone. It was not, she reflected, a comfortable thing to think about. It was, however, a necessary one. She picked up her knitting and attended to a dropped stitch that had been troubling the left edge of the row for some time, and which, now that she had the leisure to address it, turned out to be considerably more straightforward to correct than it had appeared. Most things, in her experience, were. Chapter 10. The afternoon. After. 3 weeks later, St. Mary Mead had the look of a village that has been through something and is quietly deciding how to arrange its memory of it. The parish picnic, by unspoken collective agreement, was not discussed directly. It was referenced obliquely, that dreadful business in June, or all that unfortunate trouble at the Green, in the way that villages reference things that have disturbed the surface of their self-understanding, too deeply for comfortable examination. The tombola table had been returned to the church hall. The trestle tables had been folded and stacked. The bunting, which had been left up for 4 days because no one had quite felt it was their responsibility to take it down, had eventually been removed by Tommy Biggs, the verger's boy, on the instruction of the Reverend Clement, who had also, quietly and without announcement, replaced the windmill sugar bowl in the church hall cupboard with a newer one that had no history attached to it. These were the small, practical adjustments by which communities re-established the conditions for ordinary life. Miss Marple found them neither cynical nor admirable, simply necessary in the way that most practical things are necessary and no more remarkable than deadheading roses or mending a dropped stitch. She was, on this particular Tuesday morning, doing both. The roses had been attended to at last, the black spot on the Madame Alfred Carrière addressed with the thorough and slightly belated care of someone clearing a debt, and her knitting, a pale blue cardigan for her niece Joan's youngest, was progressing at the steady, reliable pace of a project that has found its rhythm. She was, by any outward measure, entirely at peace. Inspector Craddock came at 10:30. He came alone, without Sergeant Trent, without the motor car that was too large for the lane. He had walked from the village boundary, which suggested he was not here on official business, or at least not entirely. He wore a lighter coat than the last time and looked, on the whole, like a man who has slept better recently, which Miss Marple took as a generally encouraging sign. She brought him out to the garden, where the morning had produced one of those English summer days that redeem all previous disappointments, warm without insistence, bright without glare, with a breeze that moved through the apple tree in a way that was almost, if one were disposed toward such observations, musical. He sat in the garden chair and looked at the roses for a moment before he spoke. The laboratory confirmed it, he said. Digitalis glycoside compound, introduced into the sugar bowl in a quantity sufficient to cause fatal cardiac arrest in a person of Mr. Fettle's age and existing medical history. The method of introduction is consistent with a small paper twist, the kind that dissolves in contact with moisture, which is why nothing obvious remained in the bowl itself. It was the residue in the sugar crystals that they found. Yes, said Miss Marple, that would be consistent. Miss Plummer has been charged, he said, with the murder of Gerald Fettle. There is a further investigation underway regarding Mrs. Hartley Cross. The coroner has agreed to a formal review. The Colonel's cooperation has been substantial. He has provided the financial records, the details of the account's irregularities, and a written account of the conversation in which Miss Plummer implied knowledge of the circumstances of his mother's death. He paused. His own position, regarding the accounts, regarding his silence, is being considered separately. I don't think it will be comfortable for him, but I don't think it will be worse than uncomfortable. No, said Miss Marple, I thought not. Craddock looked at her. You're not surprised by any of this, he said. It was the same observation the Reverend Clement had made in almost the same tone, and it carried the same mixture of admiration and faint unease. I am relieved, said Miss Marple, which was a different thing and a true one. There is a considerable difference between understanding how something has happened and feeling any satisfaction in the fact that it has. Gerald Fettle deserved better than he received. So did Mrs. Hartley Cross, Craddock nodded. The vial found in the wardrobe, he said. The laboratory identified it as having contained the same compound. The partially burned letter fragments from the grate. The document examiner recovered enough to establish that it was addressed to Miss Plummer and originated from much Benham. The content was not fully recoverable, but sufficient to establish that it concerned the Hartley Cross estate and the terms of the codicil. He paused. It is, on the whole, a more complete case than I expected when Constable Hodges first rang me. Constable Hodges, said Miss Marple gently, rang you because you had left him your direct number and told him to use it if anything irregular arose in St. Mary Mead, which was, if I may say so, a very prudent arrangement. The corner of Craddock's mouth moved in the way it had moved before. It was your suggestion, he said. Was it? Said Miss Marple, with the mild surprise of someone who has entirely forgotten this. How sensible of me. He stayed for an hour. They talked about the case in the way that two people talk when the official business is concluded and what remains is the human material beneath it, the part that does not appear in laboratory reports or court documents, and is in many respects the more important part. They talked about Miss Plummer, about the particular kind of intelligence that turns entirely inward, that becomes so preoccupied with the maintenance of its own position that it loses, by degrees, the capacity to register other people as anything more than variables in its own calculation. Miss Marple had known two women of this kind in her life, one in St. Mary Mead itself long ago, and one in a boarding house in Eastbourne where she had spent a fortnight in 1936, and she found that each instance confirmed rather than surprised her, in the sad way that human consistency confirms itself. They talked about Gerald Fettle, about the particular courage, Miss Marple thought, of a quiet man deciding that his conscience required him to speak. He had not been brave in any obvious way. He had been a clerk, solitary and unremarkable, without allies or influence or any particular equipment for confrontation. He had written a letter, knowing she suspected that it was not without risk, because he had decided that the alternative, remaining silent, remaining complicit, was a worse thing than the risk. He deserves to be remembered for that, said Craddock, with a directness that she found she respected. He does, said Miss Marple. He very much does. They talked about the Colonel, about the corrosive effect of half-knowledge, of the decision to not look closely at things one suspects will be unpleasant if examined. She was not, she told Craddock, unsympathetic to the Colonel. She had met his particular failing many times, in many forms, and she understood the very human mechanism that produces it, the way that comfort and conscience negotiate, and the way that comfort, given sufficient time and pressure, generally wins. The Colonel was not a wicked man. He was a man who had made a long series of small decisions to look the other way, and who had discovered, as people generally do, that the cumulative weight of those decisions is not smaller than the weight of a single large one. "Is he still at Hartley House?" she asked. "For now," said Craddock. "I suspect he will sell. The place has too much history in it now for comfort." "Most places do," said Miss Marple, "by a certain age." After Craddock had gone, she sat alone in the garden through the quiet middle of the morning with her knitting and the apple tree and the repaired roses, and she thought about the shape of the thing, the whole of it, beginning to end, from the bunting going up on the village green to the fragment of a burned letter in a grate in June. She thought about what the Reverend had said, about finding it difficult to situate within a framework of ordinary human motivation. She had not, she reflected, found it difficult at all. That was not, she thought, because she was cynical about human nature. She was not, and never had been. She had known too many genuinely good people, too many instances of quiet, unremarked kindness and courage, to take a dim view of people in general. It was, rather, that she had never made the mistake of assuming that goodness was the default condition, or that respectability was evidence of it, or that a cheerful village picnic on a summer morning was proof that nothing terrible was occurring in its margins. Evil, she used the word without drama, as the most accurate available, did not announce itself. It arranged itself within the ordinary. It wore the grey cotton dress of a devoted companion, and poured elderflower cordial with a steady hand. The skill, she had learned over a long life of careful watching, was not in recognising the extraordinary. It was in noticing with patient and unglamorous attention the small things that did not quite fit, the stillness with the wrong quality, the word used too carefully, the fire burning in June. The discordant note, listened to long enough, resolves into something intelligible. She set down her knitting and looked at the garden, the Madame Alfred Carrière with its recovered health, the ground elder held at the south border, the apple tree moving in the warm and unhurried breeze of a proper English summer morning, and she felt, not happiness exactly, but the quieter and more durable thing that lies beneath it, the satisfaction of having attended carefully to what was in front of her, and having seen it clearly, and having done, within her particular and modest capacity, what could be done. Gerald Fettle's trowel was still leaning against his cold frame. Someone from the parish would see to the garden eventually. She would speak to the Reverend about it. It seemed important that someone should. She picked up her knitting and found her place in the row. The pale blue cardigan for Joan's youngest was nearly finished now. Another evening, perhaps two, and it would be done. Outside the garden gate, St. Mary Mead continued its quiet, complicated life, full of ordinary people making ordinary choices, most of them decent, some of them not, all of them consequential in ways that only become visible when someone is paying close enough attention. Miss Marple, as always, was paying attention. She turned her knitting in her hands, found the next stitch, and carried on. "Thank you for joining us for Tragedy at the Parish Picnic. If this quiet corner of St. Mary Mead has brought you some peace this evening, do leave a comment below. I read every one, and your company, as always, means a very great deal. Until our next mystery together, good night."